What's going on, everyone? My name's Eric, and today on the channel we're taking a look at this. This is a Washburn Dimebag Culprit. This is one of 52 that are in the wild here. This particular guitar is from 1998. It's from the first year of the production of the Culprit, and essentially this was Dimebag Darrell's first original guitar design. It came before the Stealth and before the Razorback, and this is probably my favorite Dimebag Darrell original designs if we're talking about his original design guitars. Although before we get into actually talking about the guitar and hearing it, learning more about the history on the guitar and how it came to be and everything, we gotta address one thing on this guitar, and it's the bridge here. I'm going to be replacing the bridge because this original bridge that came with the guitar doesn't really hold tune that well. And I've done so many things that I would do to other guitars to help them hold tune better, but it just seems like the bridge on this guitar is not the best. And that's a thing that I've talked about with upgrading your Dimebag guitar. I got a video right up here you can check out after this one, and that'll cover everything that you have to do to upgrade your import Dimebag guitar to make it sound better and maybe hold tune a little bit better like we're going to be doing here. So without further ado, let's throw this on the bench and put a new Floyd Rose in it. And here we have the 1998 Washburn Culprit all finished up and all set up here and good to go. We got the brand new original Floyd Rose on here, replacing the stock licensed by Floyd Rose double locking bridge that came with the guitar. And as you can see here, the routing for that original bridge is, it's a little questionable. But we move, and we got an original Floyd Rose on here, and this guitar is going to stay in tune way better than it did from the factory. And it goes without saying that this is probably one of the most unique shapes that I've ever come across in my guitar playing days and my guitar collection here. I'm used to like some of the crazy BC Riches, but I mean, nothing really stands out like this in my opinion. And it's really too bad that these guitars never took off because they are so unique and they do stand out a lot. As you can see, the top of the guitar kind of looks like a regular ML or like a Washburn D3, and the bottom part on this guitar is kind of like what some people say it looks like a bottle opener. But a very cool thing about this is that this part down here actually looks like a little bit of Dimebag's actual signature, which I'll throw on screen so you guys can kind of see. And yeah, this is just overall a really cool guitar that really doesn't get a lot of love, and honestly not a lot of people know about this guitar in the Dimebag collection because there's not a lot of these that are actually out in the wild. There's only 52 red ones and there's only 52 black ones that are out in the wild right now, so that's 104 total. And by comparison, there was way more Washburn 333s, in general way more like D3, ML, and 333 shapes that are out in the wild, whereas this one's kind of the underdog of the whole collection. But nonetheless, the Washburn Culprit is a killer guitar, so why don't we check it out in a full demo mix. that was the Washburn Culprit in a full demo mix. And the signal chain was real simple. It was just the Washburn Culprit here, as you saw, Bill Lawrence XL500 in the bridge, as pretty well all of my Dimebag guitars have. And that was going into an Aris Effects overdrive and noise gate all in one pedal. It's an on or off kind of deal, so I'm not really sure how it's set internally or anything like that. Going into my Mesa Mark V with EL34s on the red channel, channel 3. Going into my 2 notes captor, which is then going into the cab section of Omega from Neural DSP. So essentially the story of the Washburn Culprit starts around 1996 to 1997, given this is a 1998 model, so there was probably a couple of years of prototyping and R&D that went into it before this guitar actually hit stores. So essentially when Dimebag joined Washburn, we obviously had the D3 and the 333s, which are very similar to a Dean ML, but we're going to talk about those in a different video. This guitar came as like an original design that Dimebag brought into Washburn, kind of wanting to do something super crazy and super outlandish that was never been done before. And his luthiers basically just said, sure, we'll do it and we'll see what happens, right? So essentially this guitar was sketched out on a piece of paper and then handed to his luthier. During this time in Washburn, Dimebag's luthier was this man named Yuri Shishkov. He's a Russian guitar luthier, and he is the guy who was responsible for bringing this guitar to life. I'm going to condense the story as best as I can, just for sake of time and everything like that, but if you really want to learn more about this and read the full story, it is translated from a Russian guitar magazine into English, and it is going to be linked in the description of this video, so then you can read it after this video. So essentially after Dimebag met Yuri, he came up with this kind of design here, and there's a lot of prototyping that went back and forth between Yuri and Dimebag. Essentially Yuri making guitars, cutting up other guitars, and then gluing them together, because obviously this is wood, gluing wood to wood, and just seeing what would happen and seeing what Dimebag would like and seeing what he would actually maybe want to play and then market as an actual guitar when it came to life. But the big caveat in the room is that Dimebag really wanted his new guitar, the Washburn Culprit, to capture the essence of the Dean from Hell. So essentially, long story short, Dimebag sent over the original Dean from Hell in a giant wooden crate, which was then in another smaller crate, which was then in its actual guitar case. They opened it up and did what they could at the time in terms of technology, and then tried to recreate the overall essence and the soul of the Dean from Hell in a brand new guitar. And essentially, after a bunch of prototyping and R&D, and you're going to see a couple different variations of the Culprit that eventually led to this guy right here. Eventually, Dimebag was so floored with the guitar, and he said, you guys pretty well nailed the entire soul of the original Dean from Hell, and this guitar feels exactly the same. And essentially, that is a quick overview and a history of the Culprit guitar. But the unfortunate thing about the Culprit is that no one really knew what was going on with this thing, and this thing doesn't even have Dimebag's name on the guitar. It's not even like a Dimebag branded signature or anything. There's no mention of Dimebag at all on this guitar, except that he was then playing this guitar in 1998 through the year 2000 on certain Pantera songs, just to see how this thing would work, and maybe just to kind of show it off to the audiences around the world and just to see what they would think of it. But if you own this guitar, you know how sick these things are, and if you can find one, definitely get one, because they are unlike anything else that I've ever played, and they sound amazing, and it's actually a really cool design too that is different than the traditional Dimebag designs. And this is honestly something that he did sign off on, despite it not saying Dimebag. And honestly, if Dimebag signed off on it, it must mean that it is a well-built instrument, and the standards must have been super high on this guitar, and that must mean that it must translate well to the average everyday player. And now let's talk about some of the specs of the Washburn Culprit, the Washburn CP2003. So right off the bat, this guitar is pretty interesting in terms of specs. This guitar has a basswood body and a maple neck, which is very different than the other Dimebag guitars that have been produced since this guitar. And even with the Washburn 333s, those guitars had alder bodies, or maybe some of them had mahogany as well, and some of them either had maple or mahogany necks. But this one is very different in terms of having the basswood body. I've heard a lot of other people saying some of them have mahogany, some of them have alder bodies as well. If you've actually taken one of these guitars apart, let me know, because I would love to know if it's actually basswood or if it's another kind of wood. You might have noticed in the video that my friend Kurt and I did as well, both of our Culprits had very different Floyd Rose style bridges. Mine had these weird big ears, or side pieces here on the side, whereas my friend Kurt, he had a bridge that looked very similar to the original Floyd Rose that I put on this guitar here. We then have a rosewood fingerboard, 22 nickel frets here, and the very interesting thing about this is that it has a 25.5-inch scale length design, unlike the original D3s and the Washburn 333s and all of Dimebag's MLs. Those were 24.75 inch, or Gibson scale length, for example. So it's very interesting that Dimebag opted for a longer scale length on this guitar, and I'm honestly not sure why. And I'm honestly not sure why he did that, We then have the 6-in-line headstock here, which is another Dimebag trademark design here. Again, super cool. Grover tuners as well, just as we have on every other Washburn signature guitar. We then have the Floyd Rose locking nut here, which then locks into the guitar through the back of the neck here. Scarf joint headstock design here, which is going to be the exact same as all of the Washburn 333s and essentially the import Dean Dimebag guitars for the most part. Unlike the USA Washburn and Dean guitars that have a pretty big volute in the back here just to reinforce the neck. Essentially, it's just two different methods of neck construction there, just so the headstock doesn't snap off like the Dean from Hell has done many times. And another interesting thing about this guitar is that the neck shape is pretty well a carbon copy of a Charvel or a Jackson from the 90s, and which is very interesting because even though Dimebag wanted this guitar to have the essence and the overall feel and the vibe of his original Dean from Hell, which I've essentially played guitars that are very close to that with other original Deans from the 80s and things like that, those have extremely sharp V-necks, and especially the Washburn D3s, those have V-necks as well. This one is a very flat shredder's neck, which is so interesting that this guitar ended up with it. Now, I've never played Dimebag's original Washburn Culprit, but I think that guitar might be a little bit more closer in feel to the original Dean from Hell in terms of a neck shape, but the overall neck shape on this does not hinder this guitar's performance at all. And if you're looking to get one of these guitars and your reference point is maybe a Dean or a Washburn with a V-neck, this is going to be very different, and it's going to play pretty well like a Jackson or a Charvel, which is amazing. We then have two volume knobs down here, no tone knob. As you know, Dimebag never had a tone knob. That was always removed thanks to his tech Grady. I then threw the Dimebag traction knobs on this guitar here. Very easy mod to do. I've talked about that many times in other videos. And then the final thing on this guitar is that we have two pickups here. This is a Bill Lawrence USA XL500 in the bridge. This is the original pickup that came out of my 2005 USA Dean from Hell. And this is actually the bridge pickup from this Washburn Culprit that I put in the neck of the guitar just because I found it actually cut better and sounded a little bit cleaner and a little bit more articulate than the original neck pickup that came in this guitar. And once again, if you find this guitar and you grab it and maybe it sets you back a good amount of money, if you're looking to upgrade the pickups and maybe your budget just doesn't account for a full set of pickups for bridge and neck, the stock bridge pickup in the neck of this guitar is actually a fantastic option that's going to get you really far in terms of tonal quality. And just like every other Dimebag guitar here, it is a set neck construction here. And two final things about this guitar that I find super amazing is that this guitar actually has no neck dive, which I find is amazing for a guitar that is this obnoxious and this radical looking. And the other thing is that this guitar can actually stand up on its own, which is pretty amazing. The bottom is really flat here and it actually sits really well and balances itself, and it stands up straight without needing a guitar stand or anything, which is kind of cool. And last but not least about the specs on this guitar is that it went through a lot of different prototyping and a lot of different color choices throughout its production years. When this guitar was in production, the main production colors, as I highlighted earlier, were red and black, and then there was a few other models as well that were made throughout the history. There was an all black one that was made for Dimebag that you can see on screen right now. There was also this amber burst that was floating around here, which looks really classy. And in the 1998 Washburn catalog, which was the first year that the Culprit was actually in production, there was a few very unique color choices there. There was one called the DB, which actually stood for the Dime Bolt. Then you can also see in the same vicinity as the Culprit, the CP2003, the DB was also featured on the 333, which was the Dime Bolt. So there might have been an actual like Dime Bolt Culprit that was floating around, which is pretty radical to think. And then the really interesting one is that there's actually a slime Culprit that is floating around in the wild, which is honestly maybe a little bit of bucket list stuff for me because this is probably one of my favorite shapes of all time, excluding, you know, the Dimebag Association and things like that. I just generally love this shape. And you guys know I love the slime and all things like green and yellow. Like, that's kind of my jam. So if you have that guitar, just let me know in the comments below. That's all I'm saying. So now with all that being said, let's hear the Washburn Culprit in some isolated mixes. I have this guitar tuned to D standard 425 Hz thanks to today's sponsor of this video, my good friends at The String Source. As you all know, The String Source has been my go-to choice for guitar strings for a while now, and they essentially have all their strings in a balanced pack. And what balanced strings mean is that all of your strings on the guitar, from the first to the last string of the guitar, are going to pull the same amount of tension, and the gauges are essentially optimized for the tuning that you're going to be playing your guitar in. And once you get a set of strings from The String Source on your guitar and you start playing on those balanced tension strings, you're going to notice that you're actually staying in tune better, the strings are going to feel better, and that your guitar is actually going to sound better because it has the optimized string for the optimized tuning that you're actually playing in. If you want to learn more about these strings, click the link below and then you can use my discount code MRTNTSS for 10% off your next string order with The String Source. And with all that being said, let's hear the Washburn Culprit in a few isolated mixes. And that's going to do it for today's video on the Washburn Culprit, the Washburn CP2003, the unsung signature Dimebag guitar from the late 90s to the very early 2000s. Unfortunately, it is no longer in production like all of the Washburn and all the Dean Dimebag signature guitars, but since this is a trademark Dimebag Darrell design, I have a suspicion that we might be able to see this guitar hit production shelves once again. And it's too bad that this guitar never really saw the light of day that it honestly deserved, because if we're not considering that this is a Dimebag Darrell signature guitar and we're just talking about the overall fit and finish and the design of this guitar, it's extremely unique. It is so comfy. This probably has some of the best upper fret access for a guitar that is this wild and extreme for a 22 fret monster. It has no neck dive, it stands up on its own, and sure, you got to replace the pickups, but that was a common thing with a lot of these 90s production guitars. They never came with the best electronics, and the hardware just really wasn't up to snuff. But if you can look past those things, you upgrade the hardware, you have a really unique guitar that basically has never been made again. And this is kind of a product of its time in some ways with the design and everything like that, but it's so cool that shapes like these and like the other extreme shapes are basically in a Renaissance era and basically coming back. But those are just my opinions. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on the Washburn Culprit and some of these other extreme Dimebag guitars in the comments below. You guys know I love engaging and reading all those comments with you guys. And if you enjoyed the video, consider liking the video. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Tons more videos on here, and don't forget to follow me on my socials, which are linked in the description as well, so we can engage further on these Dimebag guitars as well. Thanks for checking this video, and I will see you next time.